Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of the 2024 SA-UK Bilateral Chair Public Lecture Series. My name is Lawrence Hamilton, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Martin Mendoza-Botelho. He's someone I've known for a long, long time, but haven't been in touch for many, many years. So it's wonderful to have him here. He has a not a typical academic trajectory, should we say. He got his PhD in Cambridge in political science. He then worked for UNICEF and other organizations. And he's now chair of political science, philosophy, and geography at the Eastern Connecticut State University in the United States. And he's here as part of a research project, which we'll hear more about today, I hear. And he's currently working, his current work is basically on what he's partly presenting today. And what he's presenting today is on the neo-patrimonial state and institutional building, using natural resources to fuel social policies. And he's giving us a comparison of a kind, although I'm sure he might not use that term, of Norway, Bolivia, South Africa, and Botswana. So please join me in welcoming Martin to this wonderful occasion.
Thank you. I think what we can do with the audience online is, if you have any questions or anything, I think you can use the chat, and I'll try to read your comments, feedback, and yeah. So I will do that. I think.
Sorry, Martin. Yeah, I did forget something very important. For those of you online, apologies. Because of our technical issues, please can I ask you to mute yourselves? I'm unable to mute you. We're unable to mute you. Please mute yourself for the time being. And then we will open up for questions in 45 minutes or so. And at that point, you can, or earlier, you can use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll pick those up and make them part of the discussion. Thanks.
All right. So I think I'm going to try to keep this relatively short. I think South Africans share the same burden of we Bolivians tend not to be short. We talk a lot. So I think we have that in common. Is my accent okay? Can you hear me in the back? Too fast, too slow? Yeah, all good. All right. So I think the first thing, especially when somebody comes at a new place, I think is learned that from my grandmother, is like you kind of introduce yourself. You social scientists know that we all come with a bias, right? So we try to see things in a certain way, and that reflects a little bit of our own experiences. So I thought fair that I would give you a disclaimer of my bias, right? So my first degree is in economics, so I was trained as an economist back home in Bolivia. My first job was for the United Nations. Like Lawrence mentioned, I worked for UNICEF in Bolivia, promoting social policies at a time of change. So I was, I'm gonna discuss some of the isms, but when I was one of my early jobs, we were going through a neoliberalist path. And the world seemed a little bit different. I don't know if it's because I'm aging that things seem more challenging in many places. But we see some of the old discourse from the 60s, 70s, coming back, right? So in a way, notion of patrimonial state or state-led industry, those were kind of not necessarily the good terms back in the 90s, early 2000s. But I think things evolve and things have changed. So after that, I worked for another UN agency in Washington, D.C., and for a large international organization, the Organization of American States, that gave me that broad political perspective in politics in the region. I did my master's degree in economic development at the University of Glasgow in the UK. And like Lawrence mentioned, my PhD in political science at Cambridge. And I focus on issues of social capital and elements behind political processes, social transformation things. So I thought it would be fair to give you that context so you kind of have a sense of why I'm taking this angle on this thing. So the first question is like when you look at it's not that I like wordy titles in presentations. Sometimes it's better to keep it simple. But I thought I'll just use the proper terms and have a discussion of the proper terms because for us political scientists, it has to do with the typology, right? So how we understand certain phenomenon and what are the elements, and then we try to contrast what our cases how they reflect in reality, right? So this is part of a larger project, and what I'm going to tell you today is I'm going to focus on the Bolivia side, which is the side that I have made more progress. Being Bolivian, that should be the case. And then I'll introduce what I'm trying to do here in South Africa and what I'm going to be doing in Botswana. I'm going to be there next week. So this is the initial stage of a larger project, but your input, your contacts will be greatly appreciated, right? So so the first thing that I want to tell you is my understanding of here. There you go. So when you think about these concepts, they tend to have a negative view in especially in the development literature, because the idea of patrimonialism is linked of this notion of the patrimony of the state. As you know, that's a Roman word. The patriarch lives its legacy, and that legacy could be good, could be bad, right? Could be, but it's your patrimony is what you end up with in your family. And that's the same thing with countries, right? So some of the patrimony could be good, some of them might be problematic. But what we look here in terms of the term itself, right, is that the appropriation of this patrimony by a particular group might lead to particularistic interests. So in a way, one group might decide to do something with those resources, whatever that is. And again, it's neutral, right? It's not necessarily good and bad, right? So you can have a patrimonialist state that uses those resources in a creative way that moves society in a positive direction. Or you can have a society, I'm not gonna point fingers or say examples, but a society with oligarchs or a privileged group appropriate those resources and use this as they see fit, right? And then issues of corruption and all these other elements might be present and so on. So the big chunk of the patrimonial or this type of resources, they tend to be natural resources because the connection with the state is a bit more direct, right? So when you have other filters, it's much more difficult to appropriate those resources directly. So that's one element that it needs to be taken into consideration, right? So the classic patrimonialism would be the discovery of natural resources, the exploitation either directly or through third parties, and the state, again, you can see that as a small group or a much more organized group on behalf of the state, captures those resources and do something else with them, right? So this is the initial part, right? So I'm gonna link this to the notion of the welfare state, and that's coming a little bit later. So the one difference in terms, and that's why we add the label neo-patrimonialism, is that the traditional patrimonialism was done in a much more directed way with much less filter. So the idea of neo-patrimonialism has to do with the effects of bureaucracies and how bureaucracies are acting on behalf of the state, appropriating those resources, right? So the neo-patrimonialism includes, if you think about it, more hands, right, to kind of redistribute whatever that is, right? So what happened with this type of approach is that this becomes a relatively easy, accessible source of resources for any society. And countries like ours, and I'm just going to add Bolivia in the mix, and when I say ours, like South Africa, Bolivia, Botswana, and, and throughout Latin America for all the cases that I know, is that the social needs are quite large, and states are caught up with very limited budgets and limited constraints and so on. And there's always the challenge of finding creative ways of generating additional resources to fuel this type of or what we can call the spending social debt, right? Because in our society, we have groups that traditionally have appropriated the sources of wealth, and there are different stage and other parts of society that are in desperate need to kind of improve social conditions, healthcare, education, and so on, right? So in a way, we have a little bit of a trap, right? Because in a way, societies in many developing countries do not generate enough resources to push a pending social agenda, and what is generated sometimes it gets diluted with other country needs, right? So in a way, societies might decide that might be wiser to spend resources on building highways or promoting industry or infrastructure projects, roads, and so on, right? And then those resources might dilute, right? So these are a little bit of what we can say that what I would say are a bit of the characteristics of the neo-patrimonial state, right? So in the first one is like a systematic appropriation of key resources, right? And when I say systematic, is you identify the resources, you find way to appropriate them, right? And then you do it purposely, right? Purposefully, right? So in a way, you do that with the intention of appropriating those resources, and the mechanisms might vary, right? So what you need to accomplish that is a loyal and effective bureaucracy, and that's a challenge of this term, right? Because in a way, you gain the loyalty of bureaucracy in many of these societies through patronage and other favors that you have, and what creates an instability in the system, right? Because in a way, when political forces change at the center, they tend to take away with them part of their bureaucracy, and the new ones that come, they bring their own bureaucracy, right? And so in a way, what happens is becomes almost an opportunistic element, right? So in a way, when you think about a neo-patrimonial state, right, and you think of a temporary bureaucracy that doesn't know that it's going to be there for the long haul, the emphasis is in the immediate returns of whatever that is, if you're going to appropriate those resources, right? So you can think of some side elements. If you think of extractivist industries like oil and other industries, that might be a serious environmental damage, right? So you want to generate wealth as fast as you can, and then you might have to skip certain steps along the way, right? Another element of the neo-patrimonialism is that the authority has to be unchallenged. So the ones in command should be able to do this without little resistance, right? So in a way, in democratic settings, you can get away with a lot of things if you control the institutions, key institutions, and anything all the way from parliament to overseen bodies and so on, right? So one of the problems with this approach is that countries that move into this patrimonialist path, they might start relying more on this kind of resources as a direct source of revenue. And if these are abundant, it might generate some sort of boom that, again, we're not judging here, but if those are properly used to fuel social and social development, it's a good use of resources. But if they're going to dilute in 5-6 years, and they're going to be appropriated and use, and corruption is going to take a big share of those resources, then it's useless for a country, right? So in a way, the issue is that these fresh resources might come at expenses of a much more or other efforts to expand the economy and diversify and so on, right? So I'm gonna start with the with the bad example. So I think as a student, sometimes the bad examples are the best. No offense to my Norwegian colleagues and friends, but Norway is the bad example here, right? And I'll tell you, I'll tell you briefly why. Again, I'm just going to introduce the case, and then I will put a lot of information about Bolivia, and then I'll come back to South Africa and and Botswana, right? When we talk about Norway, we talk about a nation of 5.5 million people, so relatively small. The size of Norway is 1/3 of the size of South Africa. GDP per capita is, in PPP terms, is 82,000, eighth in the world. And I just, I was thinking of, I don't want to overwhelm the audience, might be the economist in me, but I thought I'll just throw a number there, and it's how they rank in the happiness index. So Norway ranks 7th in the happiness index, and I don't know if you study the happiness index, but it means like how satisfied individuals are overall with their society. I mean, it has some objective elements of level of wealth, education, but it has some subjective elements of public perception on corruption and self-worth. Like, in other words, people living fulfilled lives, right? Let's not forget that ultimately there, and we have political theorists here, that the objectives of political systems and societies, and organized societies in general, is to allow individuals to fulfill meaningful lives, right? And whatever that is, right? And sometimes we get caught up with objectives, economic objectives, as the as the main source, but economics is as an intermediate path as something else, right? So what societies where individuals are looking for is good quality of life, whatever you define that, and that will define how many resources do you need or not, right? So in the case of Norway, the approach, and again, I'll make the story short. I'll make the Norwegian story short. But I was in Norway in 2016, and for me, it was a kind of a case of like, so you are doing extremely well economically and stable politically. So what's wrong with you people, right? So what's wrong with you Norwegians? What makes you be like that kind of thing? So I had to go all the way to Oslo to talk to people and small towns and so on. So I met with a lot of politicians and bureaucrats and so on. And there was a little bit of like the how to call it, the Norwegian drink or the Norwegian blend. So certain conditions that are very difficult to replicate elsewhere, but there were a lot of commonalities. And one of the commonalities as Bolivian that I saw in Norway is that they were not shy about this sense of ownership, this collective ownership of natural resources, right? So it was a very clear, a clear notion that this society, and again, I'm going to get in trouble with my Norwegian friends, but being in that isolated part of the world, with harsh winters and so on, it forces to bring you collectively, and some things affect everybody, right? So the sense of collective ownership helps in that regard. So the state was always seen as some sort of a custodian of those resources. And when I was thinking about that, that sounds very neo-patrimonial, right? So in a way, you have a custodian of these resources that operates on the state. And again, we can argue how much of this term applies to a country like Norway. But Norway had a very strong sense of the state, as the custodian of these resources. And if that is the issue, what's the best way to appropriate those resources, and what are we going to do with them, right? So in a way, the Norwegians had this discussion shortly after World War II, when Europe is reconstructing. So this is by no means a new idea for them. But Norway, a country with relatively low industry, but a relatively abundance of natural resources, and they were lucky as well. Lucky or fortunate that Norway discovered oil deposits in the Northern Sea later on in the 70s, 80s, and were able to capture those as well. But the overall blueprint was already in place, right? So in other words, a state that is going to participate actively in the extraction of those natural resources, and then those going to be used for for collective benefit. So what you need, ingredient one is the bureaucracy that I mentioned about, right? So the Norwegian bureaucracy, or the ones that are entrusted with this task, right? And which is linked to the political establishment, but at the same time, they don't have the levels of loyalty that other countries have. So in a way, they operate in a much more independent way. What to me was surprising in the case of Norway, and again, that's the Norwegian blend, is that sense of duty of the Norwegian bureaucracy, right? So when you talk to bureaucrats in Norway, it's people that have been performing the same job for 7, 10, 15 years. Their salaries are good, are solid, but they're not the ones that they could be perceiving elsewhere. And I met with people in the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, people that manage the foreign fund. And it's people that could be doing 3-4 times what they're doing. Basically, they're investing Norwegian money in foreign markets, right? So they have to be very informed of what's happening abroad. And this financial training is in high demand in Wall Street and in London and Singapore and all these places. So these people sacrifice potential profitable careers for this much responsible job of managing Norwegian funds, right? I don't know about South Africa, but I don't see my Bolivian fellow bureaucrats having that level of responsibility, right? Because once the profits increase, there's a sense of the bureaucracy is entitled to capture those resources and not pass them along and do that with the rest of society. And this is where the second idea comes in my, in my research, because part of the translation of these resources into effective, or a solid source of revenue to push the social agenda, education, healthcare, whatever you wanna do with them, is how can we, put this away from the hands of the strong hands of politicians and governments that, in turn and so on, and how can you, let's say, depoliticize those resources, right? And that's where you have the Norwegians again, right? The Norwegians teaching some interesting lessons. So in a way, when I was talking to politicians, you said like, oh, so your politicians are not corrupt, and they were looking at me like, they're politicians, they can be corrupt, like they're like everywhere else in the world. I mean, I think the advantage of Norway keeping in track, many of their politicians is they have a very active media. So newspapers, journalist activity is quite intense in Norway. So politicians are in constant scrutiny from day one, and it's a very restricted press. And I think that's, if you ask one of the keys of success of democratic stability in a place like Norway, I would say certainly that's one of them, at least what I gathered with some conversation with journalists in Norway as well. But what happened with with kind of try to depoliticize those resources is that Norway uses as almost an automatic system of transfers, right? So in a way, and its formulas that yes, they have to be agreed and discussed, and Parliament has to give its approval. Those negotiations took years and so on in Norway, and they've been reviewed, and they some of the legislation comes from the 1950s, 60s, and so on. But what happens in terms of the mechanics of the process is that when Norwegians receive revenue, let's say the oil company, the state oil company Equinor, right? So when those resources come, they don't go straight to the main treasury, to the main bag, but they kind of automatically are distributed, certain percentages are distributed throughout the system. One of those percentages, so in other words, if you have profits, right, those go there. If they don't have profits, then the distribution windows, and they have limits on how much can be transferred or not, and so on, right? So in a way, it's done automatically. So you don't have this middling of politicians deciding we're going to invest this, we're going to spend that, we're going to create a budget. I'm learning about South African politics, but in Bolivia, the budget cycles is the problematic element, because that's when that's the big fight of how much regions are going to get, and areas are going to be allocated, and sometimes social policies become the lowest of priority, because those are the ones that are easy to kind of mask of, yes, we're spending a lot of money, but not enough, and nobody's going to notice that we're not doing great things when we should be. So the distribution mechanisms are some sort of automatic and go with this kind of like formula. So what made me believe is like, well, maybe we can find a way to depoliticize and create these automatic mechanisms, and then we can look at Norway and again bring the battle of how much and how less to Parliament and so on, and create good legislation. But if that's crafted in a direct way, the appropriation and the transfer of resources is almost automatic, right? So in a way, you can say certain percentage of the revenues go to this sovereign fund, and out of this sovereign fund, when it's managed, whatever percentage of profits can go directly to social expenditure and whatever program you want to invest the money with. One easy way to invest that money directly, and one that has been, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, is conditional cash transfers. And I think you have a little bit of those type of programs, but conditional cash transfers is a way to kind of allocate and give an incentive to certain social groups to whatever you want to do, right? So for example, if you want to enhance education, a cash incentive to allow children to finish or to attend school, and that serves families as an incentive to keep children in school. Or if you want to enhance healthcare, going to vaccines or whatever, whatever you want to do with those resources. So in other words, the resources come directly, but they're automatically funneled, and there's not much space for doing that. Sounds good, but reality is a little bit different. And I'll start moving to the Bolivian case. Otherwise, I'll keep you here for the whole day, and I don't want to do that. So anyway, just to summarize, when you look at the an extractivist state like Norway with a large welfare system, part of the success of the welfare system is also this kind of like pre-identified social needs and those resources allocated, in addition to an efficient bureaucracy that kind of manages those resources in an effective way, right? So this is if you look in your slide, I'd say this is some of the characteristics and a little bit of repeating of what I mentioned to you. Obviously, Norway has already diversified, and it's not entirely reliant on those natural resources, but those natural resources help, right? And help enormously, right? And again, not because they are transferred directly, but because of their system of like this indirect way of perceiving those resources. So in other words, the Norwegian state, if you want to look at it in patrimonial terms, the Norwegian state is increasing its patrimony. So it's giving new generations a big, solid beginning, right? So it's money that is invested abroad. And there's even a joke. I had a Norwegian student, and he was joking with me that the Norwegian government was, the bureaucrats were very creative, and they invested in Lego, the company, and for them it's almost an issue of national pride because Lego is Danish, right? So there were Norwegian money invested in a Danish company in American markets, and it was profitable. But I don't know if you remember, but the movie Batman Lego came in, I don't know what year it was, and it was such a success that Lego company, the profits like almost their shares were automatically extremely high. So Norwegian individuals, they all got like $5 more in their pension plans thanks to Lego Batman going well in the in the world kind of thing. But joke aside, right? In a way, the sovereign fund in Norway keeps growing, and it's relatively stable, and that gives flexibility to do the lavish, or not lavish, but the deserved welfare expenditure that many of our countries wish, right? Anyway, but that's why it's a bad example. So because there are things in the Norwegian case that might be hard to replicate. All right, so now let's move to my home country of Bolivia. Sorry, there's a typo in the slide. I'll get in trouble. Bolivia is 12 million people, not 5.5. So Bolivia in size is close to South Africa. GDP per capita is 16,000, 95th in the world, and we rank 69. So we're middle of the pack, not too happy, not too sad. But what happened in Bolivia, and I'll try to navigate swiftly through history. Bolivia is a country of a strong mining tradition, and so is South Africa, right? So, but I think that's where we have some differences, and we'll come back to this later. But we have a different trajectories, different paths. Bolivia had some of the largest tin reserves in the world, and those. Well, initially Bolivia had a lot of silver, and silver one of the reasons why the Spaniards settled in the area, and Bolivian silver somehow. We are proud that Bolivian silver funded a big chunk of European wars in the 1600s, 1700s, right? Because what Spain did with that wealth, appropriated that wealth, and that gave Spain a financial edge in the balance of power in Europe all the way in the 1600s, 1700s, until that silver kind of run out, right? And then Spain was in trouble. But that what I'm talking about this is that Bolivia's mining tradition goes back to the colonial period. Then we have tin, and if we move to 1952, that's a pivotal moment in Bolivian history because some of the tin was appropriated by wealthy families, and most of those resources never stayed in the country, right? So Bolivia was probably the host of one of the world's billionaires at the time, right? So one of the tin barons one of the tin barons in Bolivia made a fortune out of tin. And these mines were still productive, were depleting, but there was a national sentiment of this collective ownership. And that might have to do with with social elements. So Bolivians saw this kind of centuries of unfair appropriation of resources as one of the impediments of development, which combined a little bit with, I would say, extreme left, but at least this left of center kind of ideas on the role of the state. And Bolivia nationalized, and I want to put an emphasis on nationalized because that's my question for the audience that I'm saving later, is Bolivia nationalized the mining industry in 1952. And the nationalization of the mine means the state taking over everything from production, distribution to sales, right? And that was profitable to a degree, but it never really generated enough resources because we had a very privileged, similar, like, the places, ethnic-based oligarchy that managed to control those resources, and those were not shared with the, at large with the population. Bolivia later on discovered Bolivia already had oil and gas reserves, but those reserves were we're becoming much more productive in the 1990s, and this is the neoliberal period. So during the neoliberal period, Bolivia had some sort of strategic partnerships with oil companies, among them Brazil's Petrobras and Repsol from Spain and so on. So Bolivian politicians were very proud and said, hey, we signed this, we signed this contract. So these companies are going to come and take Bolivian oil and they're going to pay their fair share on the, on those resources. And there's more money for the state. Yeah, everybody celebrates kind of thing. And when you look at that, Bolivia was, I wouldn't say taking advantage, but the big, that most of those sources were going to the, to the private partners that were doing the appropriation of these resources. And that's here where we have some change of gears. Sorry, I'll just go, how do I go back? Oh, sorry, yep, there you go.
You want to do?
Yeah, sorry, not a Mac person. So when you have so you have this individual that you have in your screen or in your slides, Evo Morales, and when Evo Morales comes to power in 2005, one of the big things was the reappropriation of those natural resources. Technically, according to our constitution, any resources that are below the ground and some resources that are above the ground as well belong to all Bolivians, right? So they're part of our patrimony, if you want, right? So what we were doing is we were, prior Morales, those resources were, the state had some sort of, it was benefiting indirectly by them, but Morales started using nationalization as a banner during the electoral campaign, right? So in a way, kind of going back to what happened that I mentioned before in the 1950s and say, we need to take ownership again of these resources and then we need to nationalize them or, recover those on behalf of Bolivians. Again, technically they were always Bolivian. It's just the issue was that the Bolivian state did not have direct control over them, right? So when those resources were nationalized, and it was done in a very, symbolic way. So Morales, you can see Morales arriving with the military, and who doesn't like your selfie with the military in a oil field saying, now we're gonna take owner of these resources and we're gonna do that. But it worked, right? So Bolivia, we did not have to nationalize something that was already national, but Bolivia put a big emphasis on capturing all the wealth from those resources. So we had a very short but effective period in which we have the positive alignment of combination, right? So if you remember what I was telling you about Norway, we had an ideologically driven bureaucracy, which is, again, is not necessarily a bad thing, but the bureaucracy that came with Morales came with a vision. And that vision was this kind of left of center kind of let's fix our social debt, and a lot of people impoverished. And in Bolivia, what we have is we have historically we have groups like many indigenous groups have not enjoyed the same opportunities that other groups in Bolivian society had, right? So in a way, ethnically, we have the same kind of element that some groups were left behind in all the state-led strategies for development. So one of the big efforts was to kind of allow these groups to catch up with the rest and create more, broader policies to address that. So the dilemma, which is a good dilemma in the case of like a country like Bolivia, a good dilemma is we have now resources. What do we do with them? How can we spend them swiftly and so on, right? And I'll tell you a little bit about this notion of welfare in the case of Bolivia. But if you look at the sequence, it's this notion of neo-patrimonialism in Bolivia that is generating resources. But there's something else that is not, that is kind of making a little bit of a change, a refreshing change in terms of using those resources effectively to push a welfare agenda, right? So in terms of time, I'm just gonna skip really quickly the neo-patrimonial path. But Bolivia, if we move to 2006, we reached to a point that the state appropriated those resources, and part of that was one event that we have in 2003 that also gave Morales enormous popularity, and was the use of what we call the gas war. And the gas war was this idea that Bolivia needed to use those resources. We were still working with private companies and so on. And the president at the time, Sanchez de Lozada, he announced that we were gonna, that Bolivia needed to expand markets, and one easy way to access markets was to sell gas through Chilean ports. I don't want to overwhelm you with Bolivian history, but Bolivia and Chile, it's our national trauma because Chile took our shore to the Pacific. So Bolivia is a landlocked country, like Botswana, right? But courtesy of the Chileans. So it was a national insult that now Chile is going to have a share of our oil revenue going through their ports, and Bolivians revolted. It was not the only thing. Sanchez de Lozada made a couple of other mistakes, but then, but what it was clear for Morales, which is a savvy politician, is like this strong sense of nationalism when we feel that those resources are going to be appropriated by someone else, and who's that else that Chile is going to receive a share. And that was a kind of the what brought this language to a new state, right? So, but skipping the word gas aside, just to give you some context. So what you have is that Bolivia was going also through a philosophical paradigm. And Lawrence might be, probably he knows more than I do about this, but one of the, in terms of political theory, one of the conceptions of, or one of the deep ideas that we Andeans, people in the Andes, are trying to appropriate is this notion of the vivir well, right, or living well kind of idea, right? So it's a much more holistic conception of your role as individual, not only with your society, but your environment, and how can you accomplish that, right? So it's a very nice philosophical construct. And then the assumption is like, we build societies, so individuals, that's why I have your happiness index, embedded here, but it'd be nice to have societies where you have individuals that are kind of living life to the fullest potential, and this vivir well, or the well living, or whatever you want to call it, there are different translations, would allow to accomplish that, right? So what we need is kind of like somebody that leads that cause, and the state was seen as the kind of like the instrument to this living well kind of thing, right? So we're moving away from this neoliberalist and this notion of using other type of mechanisms to allow societies to thrive economically, and emphasis on individual freedoms and so on. But instead, we're trusting on this kind of guided notion of development, where the state plays a big role, right? So and so in other words, to live well, and part of that incorporates the environment and other and other elements, but to reach that point, what we need is resources, right? Because in a way, we need to kind of allow individuals to achieve basic social objectives, like such as education, healthcare, and so on. And this kind of this live well, construct needs to translate into specific policies, and that's when the social expenditure in Bolivia started increasing. Right, so it moved from this philosophical idea to what it was called to this more ideologically driven, what is called the process of change. And the process of change was altering a lot of things in our society. One of them, and you might be familiar with some of the buzzwords in the in this area, and one of them is the idea of decolonization, right? In a way, how can we get rid of some of the colonial, or some of the flaws of colonialism, and start the country moving in a different type of direction, right? So in a way, ideologically, there was a harmony with this living well, with the idea of decolonization, with leftist notions of state-led involvement, and with, following successful cases, right? So when Bolivia moved to that, to the practical side of the financing these social programs, right? What we did is, and to the audience in online, I'm showing you the second stage of the process. So we start moving in a much more practical side, and going to the financing of the social agenda, right? So what we needed is this kind of stable flow of resources. And there was a golden period from 2006, 2014, which was kind of in part supported by high, commodity prices and so on. And what the Bolivian government started doing with those resources is, yes, expanded social expenditure that was much needed. We had a couple of, I'll mention briefly, conditional cash transfer programs, which was an easy way to spend the money, and the results were almost immediate. Poverty rates in Bolivia reduced dramatically, right? So in a way, the Bolivian government was doing this appropriation of resources or sharing the collective way, the collective goods, it was working, right? So in other words, Bolivia realized that we're not poor, we were kept poor, right? So in a way, when that wealth trickles down in a direct way, it really promotes the social change that many of the development experts could not achieve in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, right? So what happened with this boom is that part of the idea was, fine, this is going to be social expenditure, but we need to kind of start moving also in other areas. And that's the tricky part. That's when the resources, Bolivia went back to its old ways. And Bolivia started building public, start moving expanding on the public sector and creating its own enterprises, trying to diversify the economy, industrialization, 60s style kind of thing. And I cannot, you're part of this audience here, South African, and you know that public companies are not always the most efficient or more reliable. And in many ways, right? So what Bolivia did in a very efficient way in terms of enhancing or pushing social policies, start doing a bit wasteful in terms of, we have money, then let's build factories, let's try to engage in the production of certain goods and so on, right? So there was an expectation that it was be a success on these public enterprises. One of them is lithium, right? And I think at least you, Lawrence, know we might have a very interesting conversations in the future about lithium. But lithium, as an extractivist industry, requires certain technology and so on. And this is, if you look at the newspaper, this is what's happening at the moment, right? So Bolivia has not fully entered the lithium market as an extractivist country, and it's to be seen. Anyway, so what happened with with Morales and this boom is, when these natural resources of the flow start dwindling, right? It put the whole model in jeopardize, right? So neo-patrimonialism takes you somewhere, but not that far, right? So the Bolivian experts did not pay attention to what was happening in Norway. We didn't have any cushion or any space for that to save for the future and so on. So the whole model started slowing down and created a lot of internal problems. Bolivia had a very severe political crisis in 2019. I don't know if you if you've been following political news, but I think I'm going to make this story short. But Morales ran for office for a fourth term, although Bolivian constitution allows him only to run for a second term. He went against the public will in a referendum that they said, no, you should not run. He still ran. The Constitutional Court said that it was his human right, that not allowing him to run for a fourth term, it was denying him his human right. Then we have elections that very irregular. Again, this is still under investigation, but elections very irregular, and there were riots, and 140 plus people got killed in riots that lasted days and so on, right? And Bolivia had a transition government. Then we had this woman that stepped in from parliament, and now to make the story short, she's in jail now, accused of a coup d'etat. Morales might be able to run for elections again, and to be seen, kind of thing, right? Anyway, I didn't want to move away from the topic, but I just want to give you some context. And part of that mess might have to do with with this strong dependence of resources and the way they are allocated, right? So one thing was the political side of Morales, but at the same time, the internal competition or factions or dissatisfaction in the system had to do with not enough resources. And part of that was because a whole infrastructure was built on on a certain level of resources coming from extractivist industries, but did not materialize. So you in the audience have your slides. So I'm just gonna that might be the economist the economist and me is still alive. I don't want to overwhelm you with graphs and so on, but I just want to show you visually what I mean by the slowing down of the model, right? And I hope the ones following from abroad can see these graphs, right? So when you look at the fiscal balance, Bolivia was doing extremely well 2008, 2009. YPFP is the Bolivian oil company. ENDE is the electricity company. I know that's a bad word in South Africa, right? Don't mix electricity with public ownership. You have different problems. I still need to learn. But when you look at the overall contribution to public companies, by far Bolivia had enormous reliance on gas, on the gas industry, particularly the gas that Bolivia sells to Brazil and other larger markets. So the fiscal deficit Bolivia was creating surplus with accumulated resources, but we never generated like a sovereign wealth fund or anything that would kind of in other words, depoliticize. So in other words, the political class could decide what level of deficit could manage based on the expectations of how much money you would receive, right? But always politicians, do things in a different way. So they were not expecting things to go that way that fast, right? So the next one, it shows you public investment. Right, and if you can see the social expenditure increase in all the way to 2014, right? Social expenditure, but at some point, social expenditure started declining, and that's again, this is the problem with the neo-patrimonial state, right? That in a way the needs of many Bolivians are large in terms of education, healthcare, and so on. So if anything, social expenditure should have continued increased, but instead the political establishment decided that maybe we should invest more in public enterprises. And again, there are cases of corruption here and there. I'm not going to go into specific things and so on, but in a way, this discretionary allocation of resources in a neo-patrimonial state, it's problematic, right? Because in a way you don't have control of how much a factory costs and so on, right? So in a way, if you're going to transfer money to people and you have the statistics, you can clearly see how much money has been distributed or not, right? The cost of a factory, unless you're an engineer, you know if it's a fair price or not. I mean, again, there are different elements that go beyond the scope of this thing, right? Same thing with roads and so on, right? But the sad element for Bolivia is like Bolivia with enormous social needs, starting spending, and it seemed like you were going in the right path, but all of a sudden, Bolivia moved back to its old ways, if you want, right? And this is the lending from the central bank to the state-owned enterprises. And as you can see, right, from 2012, right, the government started lending money to this public enterprise, right? So in a way, it's kind of been doing in business with your friends, and you know that your friends are poor. And every time you go and you have to pay for beer, you end up paying your friend's beer because they can't pay for their own. This is the same kind of dilemma, right? But you cannot break up with your friends, right? Because they are your friends, right? So the state is lending money to itself And at some point you either stop, right, or you can keep going for a long time, right? So the deficit produced by public companies were draining, resources that could have been used for other purposes, if you want, right? This is the level of reserves in the Bolivian. By the way, I'm focusing on this neo-patrimonial period up before the crisis, right? So those numbers are prior to the crisis, but now are even a little bit more hard to stomach. If you go to Bolivia now, there's a shortage of US dollars, right? So Bolivians have a very difficult time accessing to US dollars. They're restricted, right? And we have a dual system, banking system, that you can have deposits in the local currency, Bolivianos, or you can have deposits in US dollars. Let's say you have $100,000 in deposits. You go to the bank will say, sorry, we cannot give you your money, but we can give you the equivalent of, Bolivianos. But the exchange rate probably is much lower, so you will probably lose 1/3 of your dollars wealth if you take money of the banks, right? In other words, there's no dollars in the economy because the central bank is overstretched in terms of funding this, and there's very limited income from abroad. And again, I mention these things not because I like to bore you with economic jargon, but in a way, they're all linked to this notion of how you use the resources. And when those resources dwindle, if you don't have mechanisms in place, that put the whole structure in jeopardy. The other one is, fiscal balance and, going from a healthy level of generating resources, being appropriated, to now using those funds to support actually the operation of the state, not even expanding in new areas. This is a level of education expenditure, right? So if you look at the numbers, again, it's this graph, but what I wanted to say is that yes, Bolivia had more resources, spend a little bit more on education, which is a good thing, but not enough, right? So Bolivia still has a strong deficit. Education is linked to productivity that might lead to, better economic output and so on. Same thing with healthcare, right? So health, there was a slight improvement in health expenditure, but not enough to kind of really move Bolivia in a much more stable, or in other words, better conditions for Bolivians. The conditional cash transfers, and I'm going to finish here with the Bolivian case. These are programs that created during that period, the ones that I was telling you about, right? So the way the government received these resources, and some of the resources that received from extractivist industries or oil were automatically earmarked for that purpose, right? And some of them were like pensions for people of old age, right? So in a way, when the oil industry, Bolivian owned oil industry, made profits, was able to pay this kind of pension directly to everybody, right? So it was a much more universalist. All Bolivians benefited from that pension, regardless of your level of income, right? If you're a Bolivian 65 or older, you automatically receive. It's not a large amount of money, but it's significant for people, especially people with low resources. It helps in the basic expenses of families taking care of the elderly and so on. So it has a direct impact, right? So these conditional cash transfers are, again, these mechanisms are much more direct, right? So it's much more difficult to middle or to have a middle intermediary or kind of like mess with those things. So in a way, I wouldn't say that they're entirely depoliticized, but these are an example of a direct transfer from collective wealth, move in a collective wealth being redistributed, right? So I'm gonna skip this. If you want to talk more, happy to tell you all about it. So these are some of the lessons learned from the Bolivian case, right? So the neo-patrimonial state still highly dependent. We didn't go the Norwegian path of building the foundations first. So we got the money first, we're spending it first, and now we're facing a new dilemma, right? So I don't know if you've been following the news, but Argentina has a very flamboyant new president that is kind of in a crusade of bringing Argentina back to hardcore neoliberal reforms, right? And the neoliberal reforms would mean the state, all the language of nationalization will be reverted, and then we go on in another cycle, if you want, right? So there's no blueprint for the future, right? So this ideologically driven bureaucracy is now less ideological and much more pragmatic and thinking of what's going to happen next, and might bring up these kind of going to the old ways of appropriating those resources, right? So Bolivia might have lost a little bit of the chance of building a much more solid type of model, but again, time will tell, right? So I'm just going to introduce you this case. I'm not going to present this case because actually that's my purpose here. So Botswana, it's a country of 2.7 million people with a GDP per capita, which is, I think, slightly higher than South Africa's at the moment. Botswana has some indicators that are slightly better than South Africa's, like the poverty rate and unemployment. So Botswana is in a little better situation and so on, but Botswana is still in the race, right? So remember, Bolivia 69th in the happiness ranking, Botswana 132, the way it's measured. So Botswana is it's been improving, but it's not there yet, right? So these are some of the things to consider in this case. And again, this is more of asking help from the audience. So what I know so far about Botswana is that Botswana is also relying on extractivist industries, and Botswana, relatively small country, but it has a couple of differences. One, Botswana doesn't have the colonial baggage that South Africa and other countries have, right? So I wouldn't say that they were able to build fresh, but they don't have this system of, or they did not have pre-established institutions that, so they were able to create something different, right? For what I've been talking to some experts in Botswana and reading and so on, Botswana has a relatively responsible elite, right? So an elite that is kind of want to keep its place in society, as opposed to an elite that just want to live somewhere else as soon as they can, right? So the Botswanan elite is also ethnically based, right? So some ethnic groups have their own kind of like categorization of notions of authority, power, and so on. So it's very difficult from an outsider try to dismantle everything. So you would have, I think in Botswana, you will need enormous charisma to accomplish that. And so in other words, the system is more stable because it's more rigid, more traditional, right? There's a very strong sense of collective ownership of natural resources. That's why there was not much hesitation to sign those very good contract with De Beers. And now Botswanans are going to renegotiate those. And De Beers is happy because they're profiting well. Botswana is benefiting. It's, as a patrimonial state, is getting a large, seemingly fair share of the extraction of diamonds and so on, which is different than other resources. And Botswana has been expanding on welfare provision, right? So Botswana, little by little, is kind of moving in that direction of using that money effectively, right? And that's why Botswana is a bit of the darling of the World Bank. But for what I know, the World Bank keeps sending people to Botswana and talk, and some of the Botswanan bureaucrats are kind of like tired of the World Bank trying to make them, the model and say like, think of other places or do your job elsewhere. We're fine here. Thankfully, we don't need your advice as strongly as other countries do. So Botswana for me, it's a case to be seen. And I think there's some elements in Botswana that makes it a very interesting case, because if Botswana manages to break this direct dependence of neo-patrimonialism and builds, this welfare state Norwegian style, maybe Botswana will become one of the more stable, prosperous. It's already is one of the most prosperous countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but even start kind of being I don't want to use my teenager kids language, but becoming an influencer in Africa as a whole, as in kind of providing a bit of a blueprint of how can countries benefit directly with natural resources, despite these corrupt political classes, and create mechanisms to achieve much more direct interaction, right? And the last bit, and I'll finish here, I promise. Is the case of South Africa, right? So South Africa, we're talking about 62 million, 1.2 million square kilometers, GDP 16,000, 95th in the world, and ranks 87th in the happiness index overall, right? So in other words, it's surprising for many of us because we always perceive South Africa as as one of Africa's powerhouses. South Africa has, we always tend to link South Africa to Brazil in terms of this mixture of high industrial, creative development type of approach, but with a very heavy social debt. So a lot of people living in poverty with no foreseeable chances of things improved. Very limited welfare system, despite the fact that the South African welfare system is one of the most, one of the larger welfare systems. And I think some of the issues with the welfare system is that it's very targeted, right? And again, it's a different discussion, but the South Africa's social welfare system is targeted at fixing things, so fixing problems, right? So in a way, it was helping to fix unemployment or fix people pension systems for people that work and so on. But when you have most people with no formal jobs and so on, the welfare doesn't reach you, right? So the welfare it's not universalist. So you don't have generous cash transfers like Brazil did and so on. So in a way, it's a lot of discretionary elements in the distribution of resources, right? So these are the things that I observed in the South African case. That's why I call them things to consider and explore. One is that different than Botswana, South Africa has a very heavy colonial legacy, right? So the colonial structure or the administration of the state is still based on that kind of sense of the state master and commander of resources, and the political processes are very restricted, right? So in a way, that's what we called in the language path dependence, right? So in a way, things have been done in a certain way, and it's much more difficult to try anything different if you want, right? So in a way, the state is seen as somebody that has to solve the specific problems. It doesn't look at everything as a whole. Again, you correct me, and your feedback would be really appreciated. So different than other countries, South Africa has it's a bit more diversified economy. So natural resources, they are important in South Africa, but they're not the driving force between those reports, right? So what would be interesting for me is to say, look, if South Africa is relatively stable otherwise, capturing a little bit more of the wealth coming from extractivist industries perhaps could allow South Africa to get those fresh resources that are needed to be allocated to this social expansion, if you want, right? There's also divergent views on the ownership of natural resources. And that's why, again, if you don't answer now, I'll come back to you with that question, like why nationalization is such a loaded term in South Africa. I think there's been some discussions about nationalizing certain industry, but that comes with a baggage. Traditionally, the mining industry in South Africa has been private, right? So it's been always kind of this agreement between the state and the industrialist, capitalist, or extractivist, that as long as you don't mess with politics, we don't mess with your economic affairs kind of thing, right? And, pay something that we consider fair, something you consider fair, and something that society might not object, and then, we keep going. Again, so South Africa is appropriating some resources, but not in the magnitude that it could be. And again, I'm curious to know why is that. The discourse of South Africa's post-apartheid has been focused strongly on Black empowerment, Black economic empowerment, right? So, which is, this notion of economic opening, but at the same time, I think there are very valuable lessons in terms of how much you wanna accomplish that, right? Because Black economic empowerment, for what I've been reading in the in the literature, it means also certain Black groups being benefiting, from the from legislation, policy, and so on. But there are many groups of people that are left out from those initiatives, right? So micro enterprises is almost negligible, right? And then the big industries where you have Black capital, they're not the most efficient one, right? And in a way, this, there are different things in the development model in South Africa that I need to understand better, and see where the extractivist industries could play a role in this broader notion of this neo-patrimonial state, right? And again, I hope you were able to find what I'm trying to accomplish here. If you do, help me out, because I'm still not sure where I'm going. I know Bolivia is I've been studying Bolivia, and as Bolivian citizen myself, I get frustrated about what's happening. I try, politicians, technocrats, to listen to what academics are doing. They don't always listen, but I'm trying. But for me, these cases allow me to kind of understand better, what is the mystery of countries like Norway? How can they become so responsible, and in the management of the country's patrimony, and use it effectively to to provide what we all want, a decent livelihood and better prospect for our families and so on, right? So sorry, I just sounded like a politician there, but not my intention. All right, I'll stop right here and open to questions. And there's a couple of things in the chat.
Many thanks, Martin. we're going to probably have to do this together. But many thanks. A really fascinating talk. Covered a huge amount of ground, and it did so in really, really interesting ways, mixing the empirical and the theoretical, and allowing us to see things in South Africa from a Bolivian perspective and a Norwegian perspective, but particularly a Bolivian perspective. And I mean, I'm a great an ardent supporter of the idea of how South-South relations should be used to better understand the conditions under which we carry on, politically, economically, socially. And I think this is a wonderful example of that in some way. So it's open to you all in the audience here and online to put your hands up, and if you have any questions, let me know. I'm looking at the chat online. Anyone out there?
And if you don't have questions, which is,
I have some, don't worry.
You have some?
Yeah.
I mean,
I just didn't want to be too.
It's a good thing. I think
share dominated.
but it could be like I was so transparent, so efficient that you I filled you with valuable information that you're satisfied, and that's great. Or I was so confusing that you're afraid of asking something. All right.
There's a question over there. Yeah. Do you want to come back here, Martin, so we get your answer? Yeah.
For that, for instance, is able to utilize rent for development. Can you compare it with the system? But you see, for instance, Jacob Chumatera characterized as highly corrupt. And civil society now has really put in making it that kind of political system that will stay on. So my question is neo-patrimonialism, para-patrimonialism,
Yeah, well, that's a valid question. And to repeat to the people in the audience, just in case, if the question is if this notion of neo-patrimonialism, how does it fit with a democratic modern state, and like how was the like a little bit of the link, right? If I understood correctly, and how this specifically in the case of South Africa, right? And again, I wish I would know more about South Africa, that I could provide you a better enlightened answer, but I'll do my best based on perception, right? So don't judge me on that. What I do is I read about what's happening, and I talk to colleagues and experts, and then once in a while I interview people. But those are my sources. I don't live here, so maybe you have a different perception, right? I would say that it's a tricky one, right? Because in a way, the idea of neo-patrimonialism is that you need some way to move forward, and that's why I'm hesitant to call the Norwegian case, and again I'm getting in trouble with my Norwegian friends, of call them a neo-patrimonial state, right? Because in a way they once you diversify and so on, and I think the idea is, the basic idea is like, how can you take advantage of those collective resources, right? Because when you look around, I mean, if I'm an individual high up in the Andean mountains and so on, and I look around and I see like this is part of belongs to us kind of thing, right? I mean, I have my hands to work, I have my knowledge, but then to generate wealth, we're going to use what is around us, right? So this sense of collective ownership is, I think, the first step, right? And I think that's a challenge here, right? Because you have a segment of society that benefited from that private ownership of resources, right? And then I'm not going to put a specific, ethnic labels, because now it's mixed, right? It used to be one label exclusively. Again, I'm talking in code here, not to get in trouble, but saying, I'm gonna get in trouble. Well, the white capitalism, right? To put it blunt, right? The white capitalism had a very stable model, right? Because it was part of the legacy of the colonial model based on expropriation, which was again, it was a very simple transaction with the state, right? So we do business, we get wealthy, therefore we pay our fair share, and you distribute, and then you do what you can, right? So a state that kind of receives and the system moves, but there's no intention of like share beyond that, right? So in a way, taxation is limited. Surprisingly, South Africa is one of the few countries that doesn't use royalties, right? So for example, taxation is on profit, right? But it's not on, on the quantity of resources and so on, right? So the South African, historically, the South African state benefited, again, I'm learning, but not in the magnitude that it could, right? So that structure has stayed in place, right? And in the post-apartheid, again, my readings might be wrong, but in the post-apartheid, when you look at the most of the emphasis was on the political side, right? Of the political opening and all that stuff, and it was almost a non-written agreement that the economic side was going to be the next stage in the reunification, if you want, or the rebuilding of South Africa, right? So in other words, economic interests were left aside as a, we'll deal with them in the future as long as we can deal with the political opening, and that means, opening to political parties and so on. So I think South Africa has been lagging in that economic reform. So South Africa is very shy of going into strong economic reform because that might alter the status quo, right? And in a way, there's an argument saying, look, we, the capitalist side, if you generate too much unrest, we're going to leave the country, and this is what you have left, kind of thing, right? So if you leave, then the economy is going to even tank even further. So don't mess with us, don't keep the status quo, kind of thing. So that's why I think words like nationalism are kind of problematic, right? Because nationalism, there's the sense of ownership. I don't think South Africans still see this kind of collective sense of ownership for anything, right? So the gold is theirs, it's not ours, kind of thing, right? I mean, I work for them, and then but it's not necessarily ours, right? So I think that political discourse might be growing, right? But it comes with a baggage, right? Because nationalization might go against that. I was talking to a colleague at UCT, and then he gave me like a very interesting take on that one. And he was saying, like, look, nationalization has been very useful in recent discussions at high political levels, because what happens, like some of the mines were less productive through Black economic empowerment. Some African, not only South African, but other African groups took advantage of that, invested on those mines, but now those mines are, they're not producing enough profits, and they're becoming a nightmare because they have a environmental liability or something. So in a way, it's going to cost money. It costs more to keep them running, and it's going to cost more to try to get rid of them. They were saying, well, then, politically, many politicians are pushing for nationalization of these mines, because if the state appropriates those, the state inherits the cost of fixing those mines, kind of thing, right? So in a way, like, that's not what we're talking about, right? So because in a way, nationalization on that is like, oh, clever politicians, you find a concept and they find a way to twist it around and make it work for them, right? But what would be useful is if it would be some sense of collective ownership, and see what South Africa is comfortable with. So if South Africa want to create its own public enterprises to exploit those resources, so be it. But if South Africa would trust private joint ventures and it works, it works. But I think the big economic South Africa is very shy in terms of moving in big economic reforms or big projects, because the system is so fragmented, so unstable, that nobody wants to break the status quo, right? And in addition to that, when you say the case of South Africa, the public companies in South Africa have a very, well-deserved, or not well-deserved, but they gain a bad reputation over time, right? So in a way, South Africans, it's almost believed that the state is inefficient, right? So in a way, everything you give to the state is going to make it 10 times worse, kind of thing, right? So, but again, when you look at the Norwegian case, right? So you look at the Norwegian case, most companies are state-led run companies, right? And again, it's not that Norwegians are entirely different. It's just that they create much, specific rules, and the logic behind the process is much more clear, right? And the objectives are a bit more long-term and so on. I don't know if that answered your.
Can I just jump in a bit?
Yeah.
There, and say, seems to me that one fundamental difference when you brought in Norway is that Norway used the patrimony that required to build the institutions necessary for not just in welfare states, but the effective use of the patrimony for a kind of collective good, rather than, as you articulated when we were talking about Bolivia, just extracting the money first and using that directly into various mechanisms. Okay, into social policy, but then into public enterprise. Do you think the core difference is this focus on institution building, or is it much more?
Yeah, no, and it's I think this is the challenge, right? I mean, it's always reliable institutions, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the path that you follow, but the right institutions that take you on that path, right? For example, I'm in the U.S. right now. In the U.S., obviously, there's not a speak of nationalization, right? I mean, the state stays away from business as much as possible. So their institutional design is built around that thing, and for the most part, works well, right? I mean, some groups are left behind and so on, but so in other words, the institutional settings of that type of country responds the collective kind of expectations in the system, right? So I think you're right. I think if the collective expectation of a system move in that direction, you need to build that institutional base and so on, or maybe move away from that institutional base and so on, right? And that's why Bolivians were trying to put a lot of emphasis on buzzwords like decolonization and what does it mean decolonization and so on. But again, the practicalities not always match what the blueprint argues, right? And when you look at all the institutional literature, like especially in this, it's a combination of mostly political economy, right? Like all the institutionalists, right? So in a way, institutions first, economic progress later, and Douglas North and all that kind of literature. What you need is kind of not only the formal institutions but the informal elements to it. Right. So, for example, in a country like South Africa, you have a lot of unemployment, and then you have a lot of, so if you aim for full employment, as in traditional employment, that people get a salary, pay pensions or something, it's going to take a long time, right? So a pragmatic approach, institutional setting would be like, well, why don't we create like hybrids? Like, people understand that people only work a fraction of the time in certain conditions and so on. How we create the institutional settings to support that thing, right? But again, it's kind of almost for a politician almost admitting that exists, that that's a problem, and you don't do that, right? So in a way, you're like, oh, we're gonna build more industry, we're enhance tourism, and all gonna bring revenues, and that's gonna generate jobs here and there and so on. But there's no direct, effect on that, and I think this takes time. It's a trial and error kind of thing, right? So when you look at the same thing, when you look at the literature on the institutions, and that's the Acemoglu and Robinson and all these big names in terms of like the trajectory of institutions and so on. It took a long time to Europe to kind of figure out what worked for them. And there were key elements in terms of changing, institutional changing and so on. And one of them was very interesting, was that a colleague of mine, Michael Woolcock, he was at the talk, and his talk was very precise about one thing, that the King of England allowed tradespeople to use their name outside their jurisdiction, right? Because in a way, right, if you're a carpenter and you're a really good one, you could only do carpentry in your town, right? Because you're not allowed to use your name outside your town, right? So the king allowed to say, I'm John the carpenter, introduce myself in a different town. That means that I achieve a different market and so on, right? And he was saying this is the origin of British capitalism, right? When entrepreneurial individuals, right, can go and offer their services and can use their reputation to generate wealth, right? So in a way, they're not subject to the, this control kind of thing. And again, it's an old example, but what it tells you is that these small changes, right, institutional changes, have effects that will be seen later on, kind of thing, right? So in a way that things, so institutionalism, again, I'm not saying hundreds of years, like, in England or not to make these changes, but institutional elements matter a lot.
Yeah. First, in area and ideals is how on what other people state on considering how local also is a both of the things such as triangle, your density, how those things looking at the same deal of even after the how we can
yeah. I think for what I know, again, I'm a student at the moment of this part of the world, but so many nations in Africa have this blessing and a curse, right, of an abundance of resources, right? So in order to distribute something, you have to generate something, right? And that's always the neoliberal kind of discourse, right? So in a way, it's useless to talk about things if we don't generate things, right? The neo-patrimonial element comes in terms of you have to jumpstart the process somehow, right? So in a way, somebody has to capture those resources, right? Use those resources, but what you're saying is what's happening in reality, right? But there's a disconnect between generating those resources and that kind of redistribution that should be done, efficiently, right? So cultural practices and clientelism and so on, and the way politics are played. But that might have to do also with the perception of, the public perception of resources, right? If you look at you remember the slide that I showed you, and that's why I wanted to show you the gas wars of, 2003, right? When the government announced, and again, in paper sound good, right? The Bolivian state is going to make more money. There's going to be more money to be, put into social policy, whatever, whatever you want. It's not a bad thing. I mean, you should praise your government for, doing good business, right? But I think it was a collective sentiment that, this belongs to us. You can't use those arbitrarily. We don't care that you're the president. You can't use. So Bolivians were up in arms, and it was painful because a lot of people died in that. That's what it's called the gas wars kind of thing, right? Because they blocked the streets, and at some point this president made a mistake of sending the military to open the roads and so on, and there was like confrontation, and then with a tragic result. But what happened is that because of this mobilization, the government traced back that thing. So in a way, that tells you like how strong Bolivian sense of ownership of those resources are, and so on. And that's why Morales was able to capitalize on that, right? And they do it efficiently. And again, he should be praised for that kind of nationalization that made an efficient use of resources. We wish it would have been longer. At some point, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely kind of principle, right? So in a way, Morales moved away from from that initial stage, and there was a wasteful kind of thing. That's common, that happens in our countries, but I see a lot of potential of these, at least if many societies and democratic societies, you can claim those under democratic terms, right? You don't need, social mobilization and protest and the appropriation of resources and so on. That is a possibility if people really feel about it. I think one challenge in Africa in many places might be that citizens are distant from their politics. Nobody cares. Like it's same old, and we're not gonna do it. There's no sense of like, yes, we should be doing that. Yes, this belongs to us. We should be, getting a better share. There's, for example, the load shedding here. I was talking to people, and I was curious, like, how often do people protest for not fixing the load shedding? And they're like, No, we're used to it. I mean, I protest with my neighbor. I don't go on the main square and like make a case kind of thing, right? So again, the same thing with ownership of natural resources, right? So if society really demand those, and then you make a case in Norway, if you do anything with their flagship, they manage electricity and so on. Norwegians get up in arms. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, Norwegians are not good individuals that like everything comes from the sky. They're politically active and they're well informed, and when needed, they engage, right? So I'm gonna take one question from here. Sorry,
we've got two in the room, but we can take one here. I suppose it's the first one. We have a question from Romain Francis. Hello, Romain. What portion of revenue generated from natural resources were appropriated, redirected to the bureaucracy loyal to Morales? To what extent was the political crisis in Bolivia in 2019 driven by corruption compared to other factors such as the lack of economic modernization and the diversification of the economy and inadequate professionalization of the state bureaucracy?
All right. Yeah, no, excellent question. I hope you're still there, and I don't see the rest of the screen, but if you're hearing here, yeah, I mean, I think what happened with those resources and the way Bolivia manages its fiscal accounts is like they're just accounted as revenue, right? So in a way, Bolivia has a very weak tax base. So most of the income of the state comes from particular sources, and one of the big sources was the oil, the profits from the oil company, right? That they was straight into the government. So it's very difficult to see, when you look at the history of income, you look at how much profits are coming in, right? And some of the problems with that approach. I mean, you asked a Bolivian, so maybe I'm giving you too much information, but so. If you look at Bolivia, one of the difficulties was that the oil industry, it's resource intensive in certain stages, right? And one of them is exploration, right? So to find new oil wells and new deposits, you have to invest heavy, right? So if you're using all your profits to transfer all those profits, and great for Bolivians to have social expenditure, but if you don't save some of them for let's say industry growth, like private companies do, right? They share, and Norwegians do. Surprise, surprise, Norwegians save a big chunk of their profits to exploration or diversification and so on. So Bolivians did not invest enough to keep the oil or the gas income flowing in a healthy way. So at some point it was depleted, right? So that's maybe, I don't know if that answer your question a little bit or not, right? But the 2019 crisis, when you look at the 2019 crisis, there's a couple of elements related to the economic model too, right? So this is a little bit of the dwindling of the of economic reform, but it comes from the other side, right? Because Morales, when he got elected, Morales had enormous majority, enormous support, right? And part of the hesitation of people to support Morales in this new bid, despite this whole, Morales is violating the Constitution, but the Constitution has been violated many times. So, but besides that kind of hesitation, that it probably mostly affected to educated voters, but other voters were kind of concerned about the economy, right? So in a way, the opposition gained support, gained momentum because, under this boom, a lot of things did not change the way they changed. Corruption was increasing, right? And the government was losing credibility, right? So, and one of the surprising things to me, same thing, like when you look at the history of South African ANC, is that some blatant acts of corruption that it takes a lot of effort in the system to really get to, extreme cases of corruption, when in everybody else, you have people in jail in a year time, and it takes 10 years to find something, and by then everything, evidence, everything is gone. But in case of Bolivia, there's, this perception of, overstepping of Morales and the mass administration is the one that undermined that. And part of that had to do with the wastefulness of resources and so on, right? So in a way, if Morales would have been in a stronger electoral position, maybe this, this idea of electoral fraud would not have been an issue and so on. And again, I'm not gonna tell exactly what happened, but international organizations are very clear about it. There was enough evidence to say that the elections were not done conducted in a transparent way, right? But if he would have been in a stronger position, then that not would have been an issue, right? And I think that wastefulness of resources, that's what put a lot of people away from him, and was one of the contributors to the crisis. Bolivia is a very polarized country, and political polarization also doesn't help. And that's and again, because you have two different discourses in terms of how you want the state to be managed or not. Sorry, I don't know if I'm.
Well, I'm sorry to tell. Tom Lodge.
Sorry, can I?
Tom Lodge. And it's a really big issue. Well, neither do I. But I think people just say, okay, a lot of American people just corruption. So I think you mentioned the word how is capitalism the problem with it. So I think in a sense we're talking about variety of capitalism, nation, social democracy, politics, towards capitalism. The literature in South Africa anyway, I'm not random with a pen. But I'm just wondering if there's a way of kind of getting away from that popular in and it's not that the history of the way one's state capitalism, or the way working class, the way capital is connected. You might say, well, this is way than lots of business but another way of focus, other than the relationship working for the discussion, circle. And so when you look at public people, solve all of them, public people. And I remember in 2007, we authorized Japanese people company in Bolivia, but he became sort of radicalized. Anyway, he wanted to. He was studying the water.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an immediate public. So that was well, there's not water in my university. So there are these kind of public groups, and at certain times in history, I would imagine, in big pipes, but the public is not, because that is really actually because you might be abstract about people.
Yeah.
You've got long in mind, you've got a massive. So I was wondering if there's a way of getting around that consensus discourse. It doesn't seem to speak that much to the role of advanced practice in Scandinavian politics. And another thing I think might be important impact international economy for the social grant. And relationships within the region. So you got one of the years was actually there to deal with it. So Libya, you've got Brazil, the big going around Or even international.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a fascinating project. I'm not sure how you can do it. Maybe Neo-Patrimonial is the way to focus. That historical relationship stay.
Yeah, no, and you're right. I mean, you're right. And we'll provide some context to the audience about the waterworks. Remind me, I'll go there. But if you remember I don't know, predates my days of, oh, sorry. Yeah, so in my times of student, there was the stages of development, right? Rostow's kind of classic kind of idea of like going in stages. Uh, and patrimonialism and its new variants might be one of those elements that you need certain stages to go through that, right? So even Marx had those kind of dilemmas that capitalism is one of the stages. Like everybody's a necessary stage to accomplish something else, right? And it's going to happen. So perhaps, but the thing about neo-patrimonialism is maybe that pragmatic way, right? It's accepting that this is the situation, and rather than trying to kind of create an efficient state based on other precepts, accept that you're going to generate resources and you're not going to be efficient with them, right? And Bolivians, it would have known that better, this idea of depoliticizing the system and creating mechanisms. Obviously, it's not going to happen, right? Because the ultimate objective of politicians is to capture and retain power, right? So anything that undermines their power is not going to be seen, if I don't have control over the budgets, then what am I doing? Right? In a way, I lose my stand, right? But that's why these things could be could lead to other social kind of like processes, and that social transformation that you need, and eventually you might get there, right? In a way, creating those social pressures, and you're right. I mean, the sense of public. I mean, what different societies define what is public, what is private, right? For me, for us living in the UK, health is a public good. I mean, everybody deserves to enjoy health. If you go to the US, public is a private good. Health is a private good, right? In a way, but you're Canadian, so health is a public good, right? So in a way, it's not how economies define it, but it's how society assigns a pattern. And to give you some context of it's a very interesting case if you wanna study. But Bolivia had a big privatization wave. And one of the issues privatized was the supply of water, right? So water, most countries would see very risky because water by default should be a public good, right? So water is life. We lack water, we die. But some areas were privatized. But the level of privatization was such in a city in Bolivia called Cochabamba that part of the agreement was that even the citizens were not allowed to collect rainwater, right? Because rainwater should go under the soil and replenish the different sources and so on. So if you are collecting water in economic terms, right, you're causing me an economic damage, right? So when I put my bucket outside the roof, right, I'm stealing water from you, right? Because the company had the monopoly of the use of water kind of thing, right? But the water wars in a city that had enormous that's some water problems, like some of your cities, right? So Cape Town is an awesome place, and they have water issues sometimes, right? So anyway, but the issue with the water wars, right? That it was an extreme case of nonsense. And it took an extreme case to say, I'm not allowed to capture my own water. Of course, I'm going to protest. Of course, makes no sense. And the water wars was this kind of like what is sad is like it needed these extreme cases of kind of nonsensical capitalism to people to realize what is a public good or not, right? And the water wars led to a change of government as well, as like it was one of the initial sparks to kind of alter the model, and Morales built on that, kind of like narrative, I mean, this kind of sense, because well, again, if you look at Argentina, what's happening, Milei has this very extreme view, but what is or is not, right? I think in practical terms for many countries is these extreme swings, right? So in a way, so if you have the certain industries and you kind of move in that direction, but we keep moving. That's why the Lulas, the Bolsonaros, they come and they replace things up and down, left and right, and we end up with nothing, right? So in a way, the status quo prevails, and it's for us, it's sad. I mean, we don't, people that have hopes of moving ahead in life, you might not see that in a generation.
States. When you talk about which one environments, similar. Ruled by one longer communicating the child, but now we're talking about the kind of person. I mean, people choose what is the difference.
Yes.
The second one, when you talk about Norway, people are not going to leadership and not going to have media there. But he also is not up to leadership. But how come here the leadership really is flat? Is there are some factors in Norway that are really needed conducive to good governance rather than media and other freedoms. What are they? Is it religion, like institution, or what?
I'm going to charge you for the second answer because with that, I'm going to sell the mistress of democracy. No, very simple. I know we're running out of time. So your first question is, I'm going to have a take on that, right? So when you look at this concept, patrimonialism, it's more of identifying the reality. The stages of development or the way they were sold, it was an outside view of how the ways should be, right? And in a way, the traditional, that's why I was talking about Rosto, is kind of like you're saying, look, first you have farms and countryside, but you need better products, and you're going to start building an industry. That industry is going to start kind of producing certain, basic goods, but then that will lead to research, and then that research will lead to kind of innovation. So like it was almost like a Western, sorry to use the term, but it's a Western view of their path that was trying to be imposed to other countries, right? So in other words, the stages of development were very clear, right? So in a way, you expand the broad-based agricultural thing to early industrialization, then you need to industrialize, and so in a way they were imposing industries kind of thing. And some countries just skip parts and so on, right? So and you have different models, like, so for example, South Korea is a very successful case of public-private partnerships kind of thing, right? So, and they jumped from an agrarian society to a highly technological industry in less than a generation because they invested heavily on education. So the stages of development told them, no, you should have industrialized first, allow this social readjustment, and it doesn't happen that linear. And I think that the logic of that was this kind of Western views, like we follow this path, you should follow what we did, and you're going to be like us kind of thing. But again, when you go back to the happiness index, industrialization creates a lot of grievances and problems. People in places like the US are not satisfied with the way they live. And as a Bolivian, I see my friends enjoying life in a certain, they don't have the material access to certain things. Don't get me wrong, it's not that they should not aim for that, but I mean, we're kind of like the Western path of development might not be the best one for every society, right? And when you talk about the Norwegian, what's the sacred tale of democratic ruling, I didn't mean that the media is one of the many factors of the success of the relatively stable democracy. And again, they do so have once in a while, corruption cases and so on. But I think when you look at the the quality of democracy in Norway is there several elements are present, right? So there's high accountability, right? And the press helps on that, but the accountability comes from the citizen, right? So in a way, the parties have to make a lot of effort to stay in power. So they have to like really work really hard to kind of give what voters want. And if they don't, so that accountability that for us is almost, we don't want to vote, right? So Norwegians vote with their hearts because they believe in something. We vote with our livers because we hate something, and out of the different things that we hate, the one that we hate the least, kind of thing, right? So that's not democracy, right? Because in a way, choices. We don't have choices. We're imposed certain choices because it's the same, establishment and so on. So I'm not saying that Norwegian democracy has many things different, but they work with what they have, and they make talking about institutions, they have institutions in place. They're more responsive, and also ultimately the welfare state in Norway has helped a lot because you have some sort of trust in the government, right? So you have some sort of trust that that the government will act in your best interest, kind of thing, right? And if that trust is broken, then you can't really build anything, right? So in a way, it doesn't matter what you do, and that trust was built through specific things. You help, you receive education, you receive healthcare, you have a functioning system. You're proud of being a citizen, and that helps in your notion of like, okay, now I'm entitled, but at the same time I have responsibilities towards society, right? So, for example, I'll finish with this story. It's a very simple story. I don't want to bore you, but in the bus system in Norway is an honor system, right? So in a way, you buy a bus card, right, and then you jump in the, you get a bus. You can go all around the city, and only occasionally they stop and they check your, if you pay your fare or something, right? And they check quickly and then you move on. And it's an honor system based on that, right? When I was visiting Norway, I wasn't sure if I had to load my card in one station or not. And I was like, well, I'm going to go to the city center. I'm going to, I was like, in my mind, I promise I'm going to respect Norwegian honor system, and I'm going to go and pay my card when I get to that station, right? Well, the Bolivian luck, right in that bus, I get the Norwegian bus police coming to me. And then, and they show me your card. And now, I show him my card, and I knew that I was going to do that. And I just pulled my tourist card. And I was like, I just arrived in Norway, and I know that I should have paid. And the guy looked at the card and said, like, no, but you jump on this station at this time, and there's a corner store thing, like a little shop that you can load at your thing, and the instruction says activate before you jump in. The guy gave me a lecture in the bus, and I'm like looking down with the only Bolivian in the bus, the one that gets caught in Norwegian in Oslo transportation system. But I think what it did is kind of like I was getting a lecture in civics, right, from a public official. And eventually he let me go because again, I moved my passport, like fine, like you didn't know, now you know better. And then, the moment I arrived, I activated my card. But I was giving a lecture in civics by a low-ranking, he was a young guy with a beard, with a tattoo, just asking for ID. So the lowest in the bureaucratic system in Norway, and then he's giving me a very advanced sense of like what I've done wrong. And I was like, I get it, right? I mean, in a way, I don't know about you, Salva, because Bolivians, we have this honor system, and like everybody in the bus would not pay a thing. When the official comes, the bus driver will bribe the official, so the official doesn't do, like it would be an entirely different kind of notion, kind of thing, right? So, but again, how you achieve that? How you have these super citizens, and that's democracy thrives because it's a collective thing. But you need to reach to that point, right? So I don't know if that might very help, but.
Well, what a place to end. How do we get super citizens? Many thanks, Martin. I hope you enjoyed it. That was really good. Yeah. Many, many thanks. That was a really wonderful lecture and discussion. I hope we haven't forgotten anyone online. But we must vacate the room. So that's it. And just to advertise for future lectures, on the 12th of April, we have Sanjay Ruparelia from Canada, but originally from Uganda. who will be speaking on India. And in August, we will have Amilcar, nearly said Amilcar Cabral, Amilcar Pereira, talking on anti-racism and racism in Brazil. And there will be at least one other after that. Many thanks, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you.